Please turn in your Bibles today to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 16, and place a marker in 2 Samuel, chapter 5. I'll tell you right now, you're going to have to jump pretty quick because we're going to read one of those and then jump right to the other one. But 1 Samuel 16, 2 Samuel 5, today when I read, I'm going to be reading from the New International Version, and we are in week 3 of a series called The Heart of a King. In this series, we're examining the heart and the life of David. David was a man whom God himself said was a man after God's own heart. The goal of this series is for us to look at several characteristics of David's heart and to see if maybe we can incorporate some of those characteristics into our own hearts, with hopes that if that's what God wants in a person, that maybe we can become more like what God wants. Last week we talked about how David had a heart of courage. And today we're going to move on to another aspect of David's heart. This aspect can really be seen when looking at two small passages of Scripture. The first one is one that we've already read in this series a couple of times. It's the 1 Samuel chapter 16 is the story of how David was anointed as king when he was no more than just a boy. Now, we're not going to tell that whole story again today, but we are going to read verses 11 through 13. 1 Samuel 16, 11 through 13 says, "So he asked Jesse," he being Samuel, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. This passage records the moment when young David was anointed as king of Israel. Now, the next passage I want us to read skips forward about 20 or so chapters to 2 Samuel chapter 5, where we're going to read verses 1 through 4 together. It says, "All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.' When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king." Does anyone think that you might have a guess as to what we're talking about today? You know, when we examine the heart of David, we find several really good characteristics. In fact, so many that you can make an entire sermon series out of them. But I don't think that anything stands out as much, except for maybe having a heart of courage, as the fact that David had a heart of patience. David was chosen to be king by God himself when he was so young that they didn't even think to invite David to his own coronation. He was so young that he wasn't even included in the group of candidates for the position. He was just a boy. Most scholars believe that he was somewhere between the ages of 12 and 16 years old. Probably close to 14. And between the moment that he was anointed to be king and the moment that he actually got the crown, enough stuff happened to fill 20 chapters of the Bible. David had to endure years of challenges, including facing the giant Goliath, fleeing from Saul's jealousy, and enduring numerous hardships before he finally ascended to the throne. By the time David was actually crowned king of Israel, he was in his 30s. The time between him being anointed king and him actually getting the crown was somewhere between 15 and 25 years. Raise your hand if you love to wait. 15 and 20 years. And what did David do? What did David do? What did David do? David waited patiently. Today, I want us to take the next few moments that we have together, and I want us to talk about patience. You know, as I was preparing this series, I spent a lot of time studying the life of David, and I noticed several things about David that were completely different from the way that I think most people would respond, from the way that I think most people would act if they found themselves in David's position. And as I looked at these and I thought about these, many of them really boiled down to the fact that David had patience. Specifically, I noticed 3 areas of David's life in which he exhibited patience. And the first area in which David exhibited patience was in his thoughts, in his mind. David had a mind of patience. Listen, has anyone ever interviewed for a new job? Raise your hand. Most of us have. If not, I'm a little worried because you're all adults. You should have at least interviewed for a job once. Isn't it fun waiting to hear back? It's the worst. And then when you do hear back, maybe you get an offer and you accept that offer. Man, if that happens, nothing moves fast. You have to wait for drug tests and background checks and access requests and people to come back from holiday and paperwork and before you ever get to actually do the job that you've gotten. Some of you are looking at me like I'm crazy, so maybe you've never experienced that. Let me try another one on you. Has anyone ever scheduled a vacation that was a long ways off? Oh my goodness, I hate it. It's so far off and you want to get excited, but you can't get excited because it's so far off. Christina and I right now, we are planning a trip, a vacation with our kids, with Justin and Taylor and Courtney and little Blueberry. We're all going to go together on a vacation. It's going to be awesome in September of 2025. Guys, I can't even book hotels and flights yet. They don't go that far out. It's miserable. I think we can all agree that waiting in and of itself is of the devil. But David didn't view it like that. It didn't seem to faze David. David gets called in, he gets anointed king, and then he has to wait for years. And what does he do? 1 Samuel 16:19 tells us exactly what David did. You see, in 1 Samuel 16, after it talks about David being anointed king, the chapter turns its focus to Saul and how the Spirit of God has left Saul, and Saul begins being tormented by an evil spirit. So one of Saul's advisors has a good idea. He says, listen, I know that spirit's bothering you. You're getting all worked up. How about we have somebody come in and play some soothing music for you? You know, like, how about we play some spa music and see if that helps you relax? And they've heard about a boy who is really good with the harp, so that they send for this boy. In verse 19 of 1 Samuel 16. And this is what it says when they send for the boy. It says, "Then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, 'Send me your son David, who is with the sheep.'" Where was David after he was anointed king? He was with the sheep. He was back in the field with his father's sheep. And Saul sends for him, and Saul likes the way that David plays, and it does help him feel better and helps him rest a little bit. So he asks Jesse, "Hey, can David stay in my service?" So David does. David kind of spends a lot of time with Saul playing music for him when he gets worked up. But he doesn't spend all of his time there. Because in chapter 17, we read about a Philistine warrior named Goliath who comes against the nation of Israel. And when we read that story, verses 13 through 15 of 1 Samuel 17 tell us what's going on with some of Jesse's sons. And this is what that says. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second was Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. David was the youngest. It says the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Are you kidding me? David has been anointed as king of Israel, and then he's been called to the palace to interact directly with the guy who has the job that he's going to take. And still, what is he doing? Going back and forth to take care of a bunch of sheep. Listen, I think that most people, if they had been anointed king, they would probably have said, "Listen, let's find someone else to watch the sheep. Why don't we find someone else to..." Even if you weren't king yet, I want you to think about it in your own mind. I remember, maybe I'm not like most people, but I think I am. I remember when I was in 5th grade. I think 5th grade. I got selected as a safety patrol officer at my school. Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yep. It came with an orange sash and belt and a badge. I had been anointed as safety officer. Let me tell you, you give somebody a little bit of power. I was going to be safety officer in the next quarter. So what did I do? Well, I had to find the best sash and the shiniest badge. So I went in and started digging through the box, and I found the one that I was going to use and made sure it fit and made sure it looked good. And somebody came in, they're like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "You don't worry about what I'm doing. I'm a safety patrol officer." That was the first paddling I ever got in school. And let me tell you the fun part. We moved before the next quarter. I never even got to wear the badge. I think most of us, if we had been anointed king, even if it wasn't our time yet, we'd be like, "You know what? I got to be getting ready. I got to be preparing. I got to be studying. I got to be learning. I got to be training. Let's find someone else to watch the sheep." But David, he doesn't think that way. David's head is completely engaged in what he's currently doing as he patiently waits for God's plan. He's so engaged in watching the sheep that when bears and lions come to steal him, David doesn't say, "It's all right. Not my responsibility anymore." David goes after him and kills him. David exhibited patience in his thoughts. Listen, having patience in your thoughts doesn't just mean waiting. It means waiting with a good attitude. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about waiting in the drive-thru line at McDonald's or waiting for that promotion that you've been working for. Church, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about waiting for your wife to put her makeup on or waiting for God to send that woman who will eventually become your wife into your life. We need to learn how to wait patiently. We need to learn how to wait without getting stressed or worried or worked up or upset. A person with a heart of patience trusts that God is ultimately in control of their life. And that even though our plans may seem delayed, His timing is perfect. The first area in which David exhibited patience was in his thoughts. The next area David exhibited patience was in his actions. Listen, as we illustrate this next point, I want to focus not so much on what David did do as what David didn't. You see, David and Saul had a very interesting relationship. Again, I told you already that David was brought in to play the harp for Saul to help him relax. David then killed the giant Goliath when Saul was too scared to do it himself. Saul then made David a leader of his armies, and David excelled at that. But David was also the guy that was going to replace Saul. And the Bible doesn't tell us whether Samuel or David or anyone else ever actually told Saul that this was going to happen. Like, they did tell him that he was going to be replaced, but we don't know whether Saul was told that it was going to be David that replaced him. But whether he was told or not, he sure figured it out, didn't he? See, we see a few examples of that. One of them is in 1 Samuel chapter 20. He tells his son Jonathan that as long as David is alive, Jonathan will never be king. Well, Jonathan then, who becomes really good friends with David, Jonathan tells David in 1 Samuel 23 that both he and his father knew that David was going to be the next king. And then finally in 1 Samuel 24, Saul himself is talking to David. And he says, I know that you will surely be king. Saul figured it out, didn't he? How many people know that that didn't make him very happy? Saul was kind of the jealous type. He didn't like the fact that David was going to replace him. So he decides that he needs to kill him. On multiple occasions, he tried to take David's life. In fact, one time, David was sitting there playing the harp for him, doing his thing, making him feel better. And before you knew it, a spear came by his head, stuck in the wall. It got to be so bad that David had to run for his life. David had to flee Saul's presence. But then Saul goes after him. And he searches high and low. He searches the countryside for David so that he can find him and kill him. And one night, as is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 24, David and his men are hiding in a cave as Saul gets close. Saul finds himself in a position where he needs to relieve himself. But as a king, you don't just do that out in front of everybody. You got to find somewhere semi-private to do it. So Saul goes into a cave. Guess which cave? Yes, the same one David and his men were hiding in. When this happened, David's men encouraged him. Kill him! This is your chance. In fact, they told him, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. They said, kill him, David. This is your chance. Put an end to this. But David refused to take Saul's life. Instead, he snuck up and he cut off a piece of his robe. And then when Saul left the cave, David yelled across and he was like, "Hey! Why are you chasing me?" He holds up the robe and he's like, "Look, I could have killed you, but I didn't." Saul goes back home. He says, "You're right, David. You've always treated me well. I'm sorry." And he goes back home. Well, then Samuel dies, and then somebody comes and says, "Hey, Saul, we found where David's hiding." Well, guess what he does? He goes after him again. And in 1 Samuel chapter 26, Saul's hunting David down, and one night he's asleep, and David and his nephew Abishai sneak into Saul's camp. And they look and they see Saul asleep with his general next to him. Abishai looks at David in 1 Samuel 26:10 and says, before that, it says, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear." Man, that's the kind of nephew I want. Where's Hunter at? Somebody tell Hunter I talked about him this morning. He would do it. I guarantee you he would do it. I guarantee you, if Hunter and I snuck up on one of my enemies, he'd say, "Let me pin him to the ground with a spear right now." But David wouldn't let him kill Saul. And in verse 10, David says, "As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish." David says, "Listen, Abishai, either God's going to kill him, or he's going to go into battle and he's going to get killed, or he's going to get old and die. But either way, we're not going to kill him." On either of these occasions, David could have easily taken Saul's life or allowed one of his men to do it. And it probably have been justified in doing so. And if he had, he would have instantly become king. He would have instantly been able to take the position for which he had been anointed. But David refused to do it. He refused to force the issue. He refused to make it happen. Church, so many times in my life, I have made a complete mess of things by forcing the issue. By taking matters into my own hands instead of giving God the space to work things out the right way. Now, thankfully, I've mostly learned this lesson by now. I really have. In fact, I may have learned it too well. I spend most of my time now just waiting on God to work, waiting on him to do something. I know there have to be times where Christina's like, "Brian, why don't you just step up and do something? Why don't you just fix it?" But I've learned that things work out so much better when we let God handle it. Now listen, that's in ministry for sure, but it's also in my work life. It works out so much better when I let God handle things, when I let God take care of it. My previous pastor told me one time something that I'll never forget. He said, "You get to stay a lot longer when you let God sort it out." He said, you have to get a lot less U-Hauls when you just let God handle things. That's good wisdom right there. Having patience in your actions means resisting the urge to force outcomes or to take hasty actions, to take matters into your own hands. This can be a real challenge, church, especially when we're facing difficult circumstances or when we're eager for results. But just like David did, we should trust that God's timing is right, and we should refrain from manipulating situations to our own benefit. This means a few things. It means refraining from taking shortcuts or from using unethical means to achieve success. But it also means letting things rest. Church, do we have any home chefs in the room? Anybody here likes to cook? We got a few. Yeah, we got 2 or 3. Listen, Christina and I have started getting these meals from one of those meal kits from one of those online services where they send you all those ingredients and a recipe. We have never minced so much garlic or chopped so many carrots in our lives. But I got to tell you, these recipes are so good. It's amazing what garlic and butter will do to food. The other day, I was making some ranch steak, and the recipe called for me to remove the steak from the stove and let it rest. Listen, my general principle before reading that was remove it from the stove and insert it in my mouth. I didn't even know what it meant. I mean, I assumed it meant leave it alone, but I was like, what do you mean let it rest? So I asked my friend Google, and he told me that when you let the meat rest, it lets those juices redistribute back throughout the meat where they belong, and it does a couple of things. Number one, it adds flavor to the entire steak. And number two, it keeps you from having a mess full of meat juice on your cutting board. You know, sometimes in life, it's best to just let things rest. Because then you don't have a mess to clean up. And the end result is also a lot better. David exhibited patience in his thoughts. He exhibited patience in his actions. And finally, he exhibited patience in his relationships. In the final chapter of 1 Samuel, we learn that Saul dies in a battle against the Philistines. And in the very next chapter of the Bible, which is 2 Samuel chapter 1, David learns about Saul's death. You might think that David would throw a party, or at least express some joy or some relief. I mean, after all, the evil king of Israel, who first of all was keeping David from taking his rightful place, but also on multiple occasions had tried to take David's life. That guy was finally dead. But David doesn't celebrate. David doesn't throw a party. Instead, you know what he does? He mourns Saul's death. And he writes a song of lament to honor Saul. This was the last, actually it wasn't the last, he had several more in his life, but this is one of the many times where David chose to show Saul honor in spite of how Saul was acting. The 2 times we already talked about where he refused to kill him, that was showing Saul honor. After those 2 times, if we read, we find out that David finally came to the conclusion, as long as I stay in Israel, Saul is going to hunt me down. So I need to leave. David left and he went to Gath, the city of the Philistines. He left his home country so that he wouldn't be a burr in the side of Saul. And then when he finds out that Saul's dead, he mourns him. He writes a song to honor him. And he actually kills the dude that bragged about Saul being dead. Church, that's more patience than some of you give the waitress who spills a drink on you, or the cook who burns your steak. Some of you have exactly zero patience for people who do you wrong. But David was patient with people. He was forgiving. Despite Saul's hostility and his multiple attempts on David's life, David showed remarkable patience and forgiveness. Church, in our lives, we need to forgive those who have wronged us. We need to be patient with those who are treating us poorly. We need to seek reconciliation in fractured relationships. And we need to extend empathy and understanding to the people who are around us. Listen, there's no doubt that conflict and misunderstandings can strain our patience. But when we choose to embody patience, it means choosing love and reconciliation over resentment and hostility. David spent many, many years running from Saul, who unjustly pursued his life. But David was able to forgive and to show honor. David truly had a heart of patience. He had a heart like what I want to have someday. Showing patience in my thoughts, in my actions, and in my relationships. See, some of you are really strong in one or two of these areas. Some of y'all are like, man, patience in my mind and my thoughts, I'm all good, man. I can sit in the drive-through line at Wendy's for 45 minutes, and I'm all cool. I don't get mad. I don't get worked up. But when someone does you wrong, you're ready to cut them. You're ready to finish them. Others, maybe you're good with people. You're real patient. You may be the Mother Teresa of patience when it comes to interacting with people. But anytime you have to wait, it's, come on. What's taking so long? Come on. Some of you struggle with having patience in your actions. When you know something's about to happen, you're like, well, let's just make it happen. Let's just do it. Let me in that room. I'm going to find my sash. I got to go. You know, I've thought and prayed a bit about what enabled David to live his life like he did. What gave him that patience? I came across a passage that I think really illustrates the source of David's patience. It's found in Psalms chapter 27. The 27th chapter of Psalms is a psalm that was written by David. It was written after he was king. He was actually being pursued by some unjust people. We're not going to read the whole thing, but I do want to read verses 13 and 14, the last two verses of this psalm. This is what David says. I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. Church, David says, I'm confident in this. I will see God's goodness before I die. And then he gives an instruction. Wait for the Lord. Wait for the Lord. Take heart, be strong, and wait for the Lord. See, the source of David's patience was that he knew that God was in control. And if God's in control, it makes it a whole lot easier to just relax. It makes it a whole lot easier to just wait on him. All you got to do to be patient is trust in God, be strong, and wait. I'm asking everyone in the room to bow your head and close your eyes. If you're here today and you say, I need God to teach me how to be patient, raise your hand way up in the air. Lord, you see the hands all across the room. God, this is so hard for us. Lord, we've been conditioned to microwave Pop-Tarts that take 30 seconds to cook in a toaster. We want everything in our life to be fast. We want everything to be quick and easy. But God, that's not the way that it's supposed to work. Teach us patience. Teach us how to wait on you. Teach us how to trust you, how to be strong in the waiting, and how to wait on you. Lord, let us learn from David's example. Let us learn to be patient in our thoughts, to wait with patience, to not get worked up, to not get worried, to not get stressed, to not get angry, but to just breathe. Lord, teach us to have patience in our actions. To not force situations. To not take matters into our own hands. To not make a mess of everything, God. And Lord, teach us patience in our relationships. Teach us how to forgive, how to show honor and respect, even when people have done us wrong. Lord, teach us to have a heart of patience.
Good morning and welcome to Centerpoint Church. We're a community of believers with a big mission to make Northwest Arkansas a better place to live by serving our community, loving people, and leading them to Christ. We are so glad that you're here this morning. We want to connect with you. Complete the connection card found in your packets. We'll pick them up at the end of service. Here's a look at some of our coming events. Building community starts right here. Join us for First Sunday Fellowship today after service. There's no need to RSVP, just plan to stick around. We'll head to Wendy's in Lowell right after teardown. Next Sunday is Mother's Day. Let's come together to show our love and gratitude for the remarkable mothers in our lives. Show up early for our Mother's Day brunch. We'll have flowers for every woman attending. It's time to show some love to our teachers. We're collecting donations of prepackaged snacks for our teachers to help ease a little end-of-the-year stress. We'll take donations through May the 19th. Serve Sunday is May the 19th. Join us as we say thank you to our Lowell community employees and leaders by creating gift baskets and writing thank you cards to our police, fire, and city administration. That's it for this week. Like us on Facebook and Instagram or visit us at centerpointnwa.com for more information about these and other events.